Those who ignore history have no past and future. This is the well-known image of Edward Jenner inoculating 8-year-old James Phipps with the cowpox vaccine. COVID-19 pandemic has posed an urgent need for development of new vaccines. It being a pandemic and hence need for global vaccination drive has made us to think that the current vaccines delivered by injections pose many challenges like need for highly trained skilled person to deliver vaccine, high cost of immunization, calling the people to health centers for getting the vaccines, and most of all, the pain. Now, if we can give the vaccine through the mucosal route, it can be administered even by non-skilled person, reducing the cost of immunization and increasing penetration in the population. 90% of the pathogens, including coronavirus, enter the body from either the respiratory system or the digestive mucosal system lining. It is the body's first key line of defense against the infection, so that mucosal antibodies make up 75% of all antibodies. But typical vaccines only focus on antibodies in bloodstream and do not recruit mucosal antibodies. The vaccine is delivered via the nose or orally. The mucosal vaccine elicits the immune system to recognize, remember, and neutralize the pathogen at the point of entry, capitalizing on the extra line of mucosal defense and thereby maximizing the body's natural immune response. Needle-free mucosal vaccines should deliver better, painless protection. On the end of the nozzle, there is a membrane that holds the pressure in, and when it reaches to a certain pressure, it releases and the piston pushes down, pushing the drug out. I would like to conclude by saying that COVID-19 has given us a great opportunity for individual as well as collective recession. It is a time to go to the drawing board and rewrite the next phase of our existence. The upcoming generation has to be prepared and be able to find novel ways to overcome similar situations.
Good morning to you all. My name is Hriday Gandhi and my project name is Drilling to the Deepest Part of the Ocean and How It All Takes Place. Drilling at a depth, drilling through water is complicated, but not as difficult. Underneath Japan itself would mean drilling through many miles of solid earth. At sea, the fault zone is much closer to the surface, about 800 meters, half a mile below the sea floor. In April of 2012, a team took a boat named Chikyu, designed and built by Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, JAMSTEC, out about 150 miles due east of Sendai and parked it over trench. What is the purpose of drilling? The Deep Sea Drilling Project DSDP was a scientific program for drilling cores of sediments and basaltic crust beneath the deep oceans and recovering them for study. The drilling began in 1968 using the ship Glomar Challenger and ended in 1983. Now many people must have had a question, till date how far have you drilled into the earth? The video which we are seeing now is known as the Kolar Super Deep Borehole. The deepest hole ever dug reaches approximately about 7.5 miles below the Earth's surface, or 12,262 kilometers, a depth that took about 20 years to reach. Kolar Super Deep Borehole. This is the Kolar Super Deep Borehole, the deepest man-made hole on Earth and the deepest artificial point on Earth. Its construction is so deep that the locals swear you can hear the screams of souls tortured in the hell. It took the Soviet almost 20 years to drill this far, but the drill bit was still only about 1/3 of the way through the crust to the Earth's mantle, and the project came grinding to a halt in the chaos of post-Soviet Russia. The Soviet Super Deep Borehole isn't alone. During the Cold War, There was a race by superpowers to drill as deep as possible into the Earth's crust, and even to reach the mantle on the planet itself. The Kola Super Deep borehole was stopped. Its digging was stopped. Why? Scientists stopped digging at Kolar borehole as they started to hear different kinds of rumbling noises coming from the deep within the ocean, which is still unknown till date. What kind of drills are used to dug this kind of big boreholes? Uh, the machinery which is used is called a drill ship. Truly, what it sounds like, a drill ship is a marine vessel that's been modified to drill oil and gas wells. Drill ships are equipped with drilling derrick and moon.
To my project named Potato Battery, which is related to potato power. To continue with this experiment, we need 7 to 8 potatoes, copper, nails coated in zinc, wire alligator clips, and a light emitting diode, also known as LED. First, we need to take a potato and copper. We need to shove the copper into the center of the potato. Next, we need to take a nail coated in zinc and shove it opposite to the copper. Then we will take the LED. The positive side of the LED should be towards the copper and the negative side towards the zinc nail. The next thing we need to do is that we will take our wire alligator clips and connect them to the positive side of the copper and LED. We'll do the same on the negative side. We'll take the rest of the potatoes and wire them one after the other in series, just as shown. And now we will complete the circuit by connecting them with one LED. You will observe that the LED lights up. The LED lights up because the potato battery is a type of electrochemical battery or cell in which certain experience a chemical reaction with the acids inside of the potato. This chemical reaction creates the electrical energy that can power a small device like a LED light. But to be clear, the potato itself is not an energy source. What the potato does is simply conduct electricity by acting as what's called a salt bridge between the two metals, allowing the electron current to move freely across the wire to create electricity.
We'll talk about my project, asteroid mining. Now you may ask, what is asteroid mining and if it is possible? Asteroid mining is exploration of raw material from asteroids and other minor planets including near-Earth objects. However, asteroids mining is currently only visible as a long-term solution. Currently, the infrastructure and technique used in mining and refining asteroid resources is under development, making short-term return unlike for mining companies. Asteroids are millions of billions of tons of rock, metal and ice left over from clouds that became the planet 4.5 million years ago. We could start building this future today. All we need is an inertial push. Maybe you could also use a little nudge, not to pressure anything as ambitious as asteroid mining, just to try something new and fun.
Good morning to one and all present here. By hearing these quotes, you may come to know that our today's topic is related to robots. So, today our topic is robotic aircraft. First, a robot must not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Second, a robot must obey the orders given by human being except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Third, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. A robotic spacecraft is an uncrewed air spacecraft, usually under tele-robotic control. A robotic spacecraft designed to make scientific research measurements called as space probe. Space missions are more suited to tele-robotic rather than crewed operation due to lower costs and lower risk factors. In addition, some planetary destinations such as Venus or the vicinity of Jupiter, are too hostile for human survival given current technology. Thank you.
The first robotic spacecraft was launched by Soviet Union USSR on 22 July 1951. A suborbital flight carrying two dogs, Lezik and Saigon. Four other such flights were made through the fall of 1951. The first artificial satellite Sputnik 1 was put into 215 by 939 km Earth orbit by the USSR on 4th October 1957. On 3rd November 1957, the USSR orbited Sputnik 2, weighing 113 kilograms. Sputnik 2 carried the first living animal into the orbit, the dog Laika. Since the satellite was not designed to detach from its launch vehicle's upper stage, the total mass in orbit was 508.3 kilograms. In spacecraft design, the United States Air Force considers a vehicle to consist of a mission payload and the bus. The bus provides structural thermal control, electric power, attitude control, and telemetry, tracking, and commanding. Now we will discuss about structure. This is the physical backbone structure. It provides overall mechanical integrity of the spacecraft, ensures spacecraft components are supported and can withstand launch loads. Thank you.
Electric power. The supply of electric power on spacecraft generally comes from photovoltaic cells. Other components of the subsystem include batteries for storing power and distribution circuit that connects components to the power sources. Temperature control and protection from the environment. Spacecraft are often protected from temperature fluctuation with insulation. Some spacecraft use mirrors and sunshades for additional protection from solar heating. They also often need shielding from micrometeoroids and orbit debris.
Telecommunication. Components in the telecommunication subsystem includes radio antennas, transmitters and receivers. These can be used on the ground of the Earth or with other spacecraft.
Robotic spacecraft use telemetry to radio back to Earth, acquire data and vehicle status information, although generally referred to as remotely controlled or telerobotic. The earliest orbital spacecraft such as Sputnik 1 and Explorer 1 did not receive any control signals from Earth. Soon after these first spacecraft, command systems were developed to allow remote control from the ground. Increased autonomy is important for distance probes where the light travel time prevents rapid decision and control from the Earth. Newer probes such as Cassini-Huygens and the Mars exploration rovers are highly autonomous and use onboard computers to operate independently for extended period of time. Ends are not bad things. They just mean that something else is going to begin. Now, we would like to end our speech. I hope you all
Hello everyone, my name is Akshiti Banerjee and today our group will be taking you through a pretty peculiar topic called supersonic fluid. Intriguing, isn't it? Well, supersonic fluid is basically used in aircrafts to prevent a sonic boom. Now you must be thinking, what is a sonic boom? And since there is a need to prevent it from taking place, is it dangerous? Well, let me and my friends explain you all about this topic.
What is a sonic boom? Is it dangerous? A sonic boom is a sound associated with the shock waves created whenever an object travels through the air faster than the speed of sound. Sonic booms generate enormous amount of sound energy, sounding similar to an explosion or a thunderclap to the human ear. Typically, the shock front may approach 100 megawatts per square meter and may exceed 200 decibels, whereas noise over 70 decibels over a prolonged period of time may start to damage your hearings. Loud noise above 120 decibels can cause immediate harm to your ears. Sonic booms have marked effect on behavior and subjective experience as exemplified by startled reactions and attendant feelings of fear. Such intrusions disrupt sleep, rest, and relaxation, and also interfere with communications. So, yes, a sonic boom is dangerous.
When an airplane travels through the air, it produces sound waves. If the plane is traveling slower than the speed of sound varies, but 700 miles per hour is typical through air. The sound waves can propagate ahead of the plane. If the plane breaks through the sound barrier and flies faster than the speed of sound, it produces a sonic boom when it flies past. The boom is the wake of the plane's sound waves. All of the sound waves that would have normally propagated ahead of the plane are now combined together. So at first you hear nothing, and then you hear the boom they create. The huge thunder-like noise created when an aircraft breaks through the sound barrier can even cause damage to other structures.
How to avoid sonic booms? The key to eliminating the sonic boom is in the design of an airframe of an aircraft. In a conventional supersonic jet, the shock waves coalesce as they expand away from the nose and tail, leading to two distinct sonic booms. The trick is to shape the aircraft in such a way that the shock waves remain separate as they travel away from the aircraft. This means that they reach the ground still separated, generating a quick series of soft thumps and not loud noises, thereby avoiding damage. In 2001, NASA started the shaped sonic boom experiment to analyze sonic booms. They modified the fuselage of a Northrop 4 5E Tiger II in an attempt to lower the effects of sonic boom during test flights. The nose of the F5E was removed and replaced with a larger, longer version. The fairing under the fuselage was also lengthened and deepened. The modified F5E, or shaped sonic boom demonstrator, flew in 2003, and from that point, NASA took 1,300 sonic boom measurements from various ground sensors. NASA engineers confirmed that the modification led to an 18% reduction of initial pressure impulse, and booms were an average of 4.5 decibels quieter compared to an unmodified F5E.
The latest NASA research comes from American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, which held its first sonic boom prediction workshop in 2014. The workshop's purpose was to assess the current technology for predicting sonic boom propagation. The presentations consisted of latest techniques in computation, fluid dynamics software to help design and build better aircraft bodies and wings. This could lead to more defined supersonic fluid envelopes that pilot could adhere to, thereby creating fewer and smaller booms. Researchers demonstrated that supersonic airfoils can be constructed to induce passive laminar flow control LFC. This reduces or eliminates the turbulent cross flow on the wings that produce shock waves. Consequently, the goal of this research is to create LFC on that wing that would in effect mean the wing's leading edge would remain subsonic during supersonic flights. The absence of supersonic leading edge would reduce shock waves and minimize flow disturbances, producing more stable and efficient flights. Researchers performed at MIT Labs for Aviation and the Environment with NASA's help is analyzing the effect of sonic booms on the environment.
Hypermac Aerospace in UK introduced a plan in 2011 to reduce sonic booms by using electromagnetic reduction technology on its Sonic Star aircraft. The engines designed by Hypermax's sister's company, Sonic Blue Aerospace, are supersonic, magnetic, advanced generation jet electronic turbines, also called the S-MAG jets. The engine comprises of an electrical power and propulsion generator and a magnetic power flux field system with ion plasma annular injection. This engine also generates about 30.5 megawatts of electrical power. It also generates 54,700 pounds of thrust. Most of the electricity flows to power the bypass fans, the combustor and the generator. The excess electricity of 7 megawatts flows to the electrical sub-departments to power the landing revenues, avionics and the redundant systems. The magnetic field system also derives its power from the electronic turbine ring generator. Plasma is derived when there is an active electric current between two electrodes. The magnetic field system also controls and navigates the combustion and allows complete procedure of burning of the atomized and ionized fuel.
Supersonic magnetic advanced generation jet electric turbine, that is S-MAG jet, designed by Sonic Blue Aerospace for Hypermesh Sonic Star aircraft, relies on ion plasma injected ahead of the planar shock wave to reduce drag and the sonic boom. The engine has a hollow shaft core, that is no speed or the drive shaft, and the engine electromagnetically powers the bypass fan, compressor and turbine. The sonic stud reduces sonic boom by injecting plasma ahead of the shock wave. It uses plasma actuators built into the aircraft and powered by the S-MAG jet engines to ionize the air as it passes from forward to the shaft. The plasma aircraft gives the high pressure and escape route to travel around the aircraft instead of coming in direct contact, avoiding the creation and drag and shock waves.
We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hand the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God.
Greetings everyone. Today we bring forward to you our project called Pfizer, Disease or Cure. So let's just get into it. Vaccines by definition are biological agents that elicit an immune response to a specific antigen derived from an infectious disease-causing pathogen. Vaccines work by training and preparing the body's natural defenses, the immune system, by recognizing and fighting off the viruses and the bacteria they target. If the body is exposed to those disease-causing germs later, the body is immediately ready to destroy them, preventing illness. I'm pretty sure that all of you might be knowing about this pandemic, but before moving ahead with the explanation of our topic, I would like to give you all information about the symptoms of COVID-19. COVID-19 affects different people in different ways. Most of the infected people develop a mild to moderate illness and recover without any hospitalization. The most common symptoms are fever, dry cough, and tiredness. The less common symptoms are aches and pains, sore throat, diarrhea, conjunctivitis, headaches, loss of taste or smell, rash on the skin, and discoloration of fingers and toes. All these symptoms must be kept in mind before the making of a vaccine for this pandemic.
How do vaccines get approved? There are many strict protections in place to help ensure that COVID-19 vaccines will be safe. Like all vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines should go through a rigorous multi-stage testing process, including a large phase 3 trial that involves tens of thousands of people. These trials, which include the people at high risk for COVID-19, are specifically designed to identify any common side effects or other safety concerns. An external panel of experts convened by WHO will analyze the results from clinical trials along with the evidence on the disease, age groups affected, risk factors for disease, and other information, and will recommend whether and how the vaccine should be used.
OWS has selected 3 vaccine candidates to fund for phase 3 trials: Moderna's mRNA-1273, University of Oxford and AstraZeneca's AZD1222, and Pfizer and BioNTech. When will companies roll out a vaccine? Pfizer, Moderna and AstraZeneca have already started manufacturing their vaccines this year. Pfizer said it will have enough to inoculate 25 million people. AstraZeneca will have enough for more than 100 million people, and Moderna will have enough for 10 million people. Most countries have said the first vaccine will go to the elderly and vulnerable and the people and workers like the doctors. Countries say they are buying vaccines via the European Commission's Joint Procurement Scheme, which has deal for 6 different vaccines and nearly 2 billion doses.
Let's first start with the basics. Right now, about 0.1 milligrams of the vaccine is being inoculated into human test patients. The main ingredient is a piece of lab-engineered RNA, which is injected into the body. It's ribonucleic acid. The RNA has an instruction manual of sorts that is given to human cells so that they can begin to create spike proteins, just like the ones you've seen on the outside of coronavirus. Those red protein spikes allow it to cling to and hijack certain cells, but if our own cells are taught how to build these spikes, they can fend off the coronavirus on their own and prevent infection, and hopefully the body is learning how to create antibodies so it can continue to fight off the virus on its own. 30,000 test patients are involved in phase 3 of the Moderna vaccine trial. 15,000 are inoculated with the test vaccine. The other 15,000 receive a placebo. It sounds strange, but scientists actually hope to see some of the placebo test subjects naturally stumble onto the virus out in the community and even become infected the way that they know the vaccine is working.
When will developing countries have access to the vaccine? COVAX, a program led by the World Health Organization and the GAVI vaccine group to pool funds from wealthier countries and non-profits to buy and distribute vaccines to dozens of poorer countries, has raised a sum total of $2 billion.
Vaccine makers and governments have negotiated varying prices, not all of which are public. Governments have paid from a few dollars per AstraZeneca shot to up to $50 for the 2-dose Pfizer regimen. Many countries have said that they will cover the cost of inoculating their residents.
Facts about the vaccine. American pharmaceutical company Pfizer Inc. and its German partner BioNTech said that their coronavirus vaccine was found to be 95% effective in a late-stage trial, including in people aged over 65 years. This has paved the way for the global drug makers to apply for emergency authorization from US Food and Drug Administration within days, after more data indicate it is working safely. Pfizer and BioNTech also said they have concluded phase 3 study of their mRNA-based coronavirus vaccine candidate BNT162b2, meeting all primary efficacy endpoints. On vaccine safety, the drug maker said that 2-dose vaccine was well tolerated in 8,000 study subjects. In the group, the most frequent severe side effect was fatigue in 3.8% of the volunteers who fell ill, while 2% of the group reported headaches.
However, this is not enough to establish the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine. Serious side effects tend to surface within 6 weeks of inoculation, so the US FDA requested researchers wait to see how half a study subject fared for 2 months after their second dose. Pfizer and BioNTech say that they have data and are analyzing it. They are yet to reveal the fuller safety data. The COVID-19 vaccine is on track to be cleared as clearly as December, so long as it proves to be safe, and distribution could start soon after. Based on current projections, the firm expects to produce globally up to 50 million vaccine doses in 2020 and up to 1.3 million doses by the end of 2021. This means only the highest risk group, such as frontline healthcare workers, could be inoculated this year. Many more doses would be needed to cover the US and global population.
PCR was invented in 1984 by the American biochemist Kary Mullis at Cedars Corporation. It is a fundamental genetic testing including analysis of ancient samples of DNA and identification of infectious agents. Using PCR, copies of very small amounts of DNA samples are exponentially amplified in a series of cycles of temperature changes. PCR is now a common and often indispensable technique used in medical and clinical laboratory research for a broad variety of applications, including biochemical research and criminal forensics. Polymerase chain reaction, known as PCR, is an evidently used technique in molecular biology to make millions and billions of copies of DNA rapidly. But why do we need so many copies of DNA? This process, evidently known as amplification of DNA, is necessary to have enough quantity of DNA for carrying out various tests at molecular level.
When the genetic material is RNA instead of DNA, the RNA molecules must be converted into their complementary DNA sequence by an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. The newly synthesized DNA can be amplified by standard PCR procedure.
To perform this method, vital RNA should be extracted using a commercial kit. The sample is added into a microcentrifuge tubes and then mixed with a lysis buffer. The lysis buffer is denaturing in nature and ensures isolation of intact RNA. Once sample is lysed, a purification procedure is carried out by using a spin column where the sample is loaded and the centrifugation is performed. RNA molecules bind to the silica gel membrane in the column and all other contaminants including protein passes through. The filtrate is then discarded by placing the sun column in a clear collection tube. RNA is then eluted out of the silica gel by using a elution buffer. In this entire process, we get a purified RNA. As RNA is obtained, the reaction mixture for PCR amplification is prepared. In this step, a master mix is used, which is a premixed concentrated solution that consists of buffer RT enzyme, nucleotides, forward primer, reverse primer, Tachman Pro, DNA polymerase. The RNA is added to this reaction. The reaction mixture is loaded into a PCR plate which generally contains 96 wells. This allows analysis of several samples at the same time.
Real-time polymerase chain reaction, real-time PCR, also known as quantitative polymerase chain reaction, qPCR, is a laboratory technique of molecular biology based on the polymerase chain reaction, PCR. It monitors the amplification of a targeted DNA molecule during the PCR, that is in real time, not at its end as in conventional PCR.
Pandit will explain you about what is PCR. Now PCR is polymerase chain reaction, is often considered as one of the most important scientific advances in the field of molecular biology. With this revolutionary yet inexpensive biochemical technology, it's possible to generate millions of DNA copies from a single strand of DNA.
The first step in RT-PCR is reverse transcription, where a complementary DNA is synthesized. Next, an initial denaturation step is applied, causing denaturation of the DNA and RNA hybrid. This step activates an enzyme called DNA polymerase and inactivates reverse transcriptase used earlier. In the first step of PCR, the two strands of the DNA double helix are physically separated at a high temperature in a process called nucleic acid denaturation. In the second step, the temperature is lowered and the primers bind to the complementary sequences of the DNA. The two DNA strands then become templates for DNA polymerase to enzymatically assemble a new DNA strand from free nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA.
Traditional PCR has advanced from detection at the endpoints of the reaction to detection while the reaction is occurring. Real-time chemistries allow for the detection during the early phases of the reaction.
What if we settled on Mars?
What would life on Mars look like?
Would we live on the surface?
Or would we hide underground?
Would we be able to terraform it?
We've come so far from that very first small step for a man, but not as far as our dreams will take us. Within a decade or two, Mars will be our next destination. But are we ready to survive it? This is how to survive on Mars. This red planet is our neighbor in the solar system, but it has none of the components that make life possible here on Earth. It's full of radiation and is too cold to have liquid water. It has an atmosphere in which we can breathe and soil that we can't grow anything with. Its gusts of winds are like hurricanes here on Earth, and now we want to make it a new home.
Mars, the red planet in the solar system, has certain paths which cannot be denied to live on it. Firstly, to ensure the survival of our species. With the dynamic growth in the population day by day, it is very hard enough to feed the huge growing population. It is quite crucial for us to ensure the survival of the human race. Second, studying Earth. Mars is the only planet which is quite similar to the Earth and is the closest and the only way to find out the truth and study the Earth closely. Thirdly, Mars has a lot of water. Another element that supports life is indeed water, and the study have found there is a lot of water available on Mars. Fourthly, there is enough sunlight to use solar panels. Fifth, coolness. Mars is relatively very cool and easy to adapt.
Martian atmosphere does not have enough oxygen for humans to breathe, so some artificial arrangement has to be made. Mars has 96% of carbon dioxide and a device called MOXIE which helps to convert carbon dioxide to oxygen so that it can make easy to breathe on Mars.
Mars is too cold to have liquid water. Instead, it has water, frozen as the polar ice caps.
Of course, we can't bring a year-long water supply with us all the way to Mars, but here's what you can do. Some initiatives suggest ways that you could extract water in such Martian conditions. One of them being aerogel, developed by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. This silica substance is meant to warm the surface of Mars by 65 degrees. That's the way to melt Martian ice water and have a supply of drinking water as well as for irrigation. Or you could filter your pee as the astronauts on the International Space Station do.
We cannot grow plants on the surface of Mars due to the hostile conditions. So Martians should focus on high-yield genetically edited crops that can adopt to high carbon dioxide levels of Mars. Plants can be grown hydroponically in nutrient-rich solutions. Let me show an example. In 2018, German scientists in Antarctica at ADEP ISI greenhouse harvested a huge crop of vegetables hydroponically in controlled environment with LED Pro lights. In 9 months, they produced 268 kgs of food in 12.8 square meter of space. What about the low gravity? Well, we all know astronauts have grown lettuce on the International Space Station. So on Mars, an attractive alternative is to grow plants in tunnels with high-strength LED lighting supplemented with sunlight collected and piped down through fiber optic cables. Animal protein is something which people cannot forego. The right answer to the animal protein is insects. This may sound crazy, but insects require less space and resources to grow. Another option is lab-grown meat, which means harvesting cells from animals and multiplying them in the laboratory. So now, when you land on Mars, this will be your menu card.
The surface of Mars has extreme temperatures and the atmosphere does not provide adequate protection from high energy radiation. These explorers will need shelters to effectively protect them from the harsh Martian environment and provide a safe place to call home. The best building material for a new home on Mars may lie in an unexpected material, which is ice. The Mars ice home is a large inflatable torus, a shape similar to an inner tube that is surrounded by a shell of water ice. The Mars ice home design has several advantages that make it an appealing concept. It is lightweight and can be transported and deployed with simple robotics. It is then filled with water before the crew arrives. Space radiation is also a significant change for those designing potential Mars outputs.
To survive on Mars, we need power. Till yet, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Pathfinder, which have reached Mars, have used solar panels and nickel-hydrogen batteries at night, which were charged every day with solar energy. The Mars Pathfinder even used junction gallium arsenide solar cells, which are again charged with solar power. So, according to a Forbes article in 2016, surviving in Mars requires a long-term source of energy. Hence, the travel to Mars and the first generation of Mars colonists will be able to sustain themselves on solar power and radioisotope thermoelectric generators, or RTGs for short, where a radioisotope thermoelectric generator is a type of nuclear battery that uses an array of thermocouples to convert the heat released by the decay of suitable radioactive material into electricity by the Seebeck effect. But for the second generation, the colonists will need some sort of energy which comes from the planet itself. The best and possibly only source of energy strong enough to sustain generations of Mars colonists is geothermal energy. Why not solar, nuclear, wind or RTGs, you may ask? Mars is too far from the sun, so using solar panels would be 10 years at best. RTGs are fine for producing tens of watts, but they are not suitable for hundreds of residents, let alone thousands. Mars has around 2% the atmosphere that Earth has, and hence wind power is negligible, and nuclear power production requires a robust infrastructure. Hence, to survive on Mars, we need to tap into the planet's seemingly endless supply of geothermal energy.
All communication between Mars and the Earth goes through satellite. Because the distance is a substantial delay, as communication signals travel at the speed of a light, this means it may take a few minutes for the information to reach at the other end. Fortunately, there will be no limitation in emailing, texting with the Mars resident. It would just take 6 minutes for you to get the reply. Both voicemail and the video messages are easily workable options. The astronaut can use internet but can surf real time on a number of the websites that are being downloaded from the Earth on the Mars Habitat web server. Every astronaut will have access to their favorite website in that event.
NASA, SpaceX, ISRO, Japan, UAE, etc. are currently working on the Mars mission. SpaceX, a venture led by Elon Musk, is leading from the front and aims to send several unmanned missions to Mars in the next 5 years in order to establish several machineries as would be required to settle permanently on Mars. It is never easy doing that. Transporting large systems with less fuel, which means more efficiency would require a lot of hard work. But our scientists are committed and we definitely imagine life on Mars. But definitely after a decade or two. Currently, projects like ExoMars rover, Perseverance rover, etc. are to leave for Mars in the next 2 years. SpaceX is concentrating on the rocket that could transport a large number of people or machinery together at a high speed, thus increasing efficiency. Different agencies are trying different things at their levels, but all efforts ultimately boil down to one conclusion that life is possible on Mars. Hey there, I am Preet from 2050. And guess what? Yes, I am on Mars. Yes, it is red all around. Humans spend trillions of dollars, but yes, success it is. We have finally reached Mars, and life here today is quite similar to that on Earth. So small, a message for the humans. It is all worth, but yes, only if Mars is not polluted like the Earth was. So, dear humans, take care.
Everybody, I, Master Sankalp Tiwari,
and I, Master Arav Advani, together we will present the topic on self-healing concrete.
Concrete is the most widely used construction material in the world. It can be found in the swaths of the city pavements, bridges that span vast rivers, and the tallest skyscrapers in the world. But this sturdy substance does have a weakness. It is prone to catastrophic cracking that costs tens of millions of dollars to repair each year.
But what if we could avoid this problem by creating concrete that heals itself? This idea isn't as difficult as it may seem. It boils down to an understanding that how concrete is formed and how to exploit that process to our benefit.
Concrete is a combination of coarse stone and sand particles called aggregates that mix with cement, a powdered blend of clay and limestone. When water gets added to this mix, the cement forms the paste and coats the aggregates, quickly hardening through a chemical reaction called hydration. Eventually, the resulting material grows strong enough to pop up buildings that climbs hundreds of meters into the sky.
While people have been using a variety of recipes to produce cement for over 4,000 years, concrete itself has a surprisingly short lifespan. After around 20 to 30 years, natural processes like concrete shrinkage, excessive freezing, and heavy loads can trigger cracking. And it is not just big cracks that count. Tiny cracks can be just as dangerous. Concrete is often used as a secondary support around steel reinforcements. In this concrete, even small cracks can channel water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide that corrode the steel and lead to disastrous collapse. On structures like bridges and highways that are constantly used, detecting problems before they lead to catastrophe becomes more huge and costly challenge, but not doing so would also endanger thousands of lives.
Fortunately, we are already experimenting with ways this material could start fixing itself, and some of the solutions inspired by concrete's natural self-healing mechanism. When water enters the tiny cracks, it hydrates the concrete's calcium oxide. The resulting calcium hydroxide reacts with carbon dioxide in the air, starting a process called autogenous healing, where microscopic calcium carbonate crystals form and gradually fill the gaps. Unfortunately, this crystal can only do so much healing cracks that are less than 0.3 mm wide. Material scientists have figured out how to heal cracks up to twice that size by adding hidden glue to the concrete mix. If we put adhesive fibers and tubes into the mixture, they will snap open when a thread forms and releasing their sticky contents and sealing the gap. Adhesive chemicals often behave very differently from the concrete, and over time these adhesives can lead to even worse cracks. So perhaps the best way to heal the large cracks is to give concrete the tools to help itself. Scientists have discovered that some bacteria and fungi can produce minerals including the calcium carbonate found in autogenous healing. Experimental blends of concrete which include these bacterial or fungal spores alongside nutrients in the concrete mix where they could lie dormant for hundreds of years. When cracks appear finally and water trickles into the concrete spores, they germinate, grow, and consume the nutrient soup that surrounds them, modifying the local environment to create the perfect conditions for calcium carbonate to grow. These crystals formed gradually fill the gaps, and after roughly 3 weeks, the hard-working microbes can completely repair the cracks up to almost 1 millimeter wide. When the cracks seal, the bacteria and fungi will make spores and go dormant once more, ready to start a new cycle of self-healing when cracks form again.
Advantages of self-healing concrete are as follows. First, it helps to fill the cracks. Second, it reduces the permeability of the concrete. Third, it reduces the cost on maintenance and repair. Fourth, it makes the concrete more stronger. Now, the concrete formed can last for centuries, and further researches may lead to betterment of this concrete.
Nothing in this universe is static. In the Milky Way, billions of stars orbit the galactic center. Some, like our Sun, are pretty consistent, keeping a distance of around 30,000 light years from the galactic center, completing an orbit every 230 million years. Our topic is stellar engine. Stellar engines belong to a class of hypothetical megastructures which use a star's radiation to create usable energy. This concept has been introduced by Badescu and Cathcart. Some variants use this energy to produce thrust and thus accelerate a star and anything orbiting it in a given direction.
Neighborhood is constantly changing with the stars moving hundreds of kilometers every second. Only the vast distance between the object protects us from the danger out there. But we might get unlucky in the future. At some point, we could encounter a star going supernova or massive objects passing by, or showering the earth with asteroids. If something like this were to happen, we would likely know thousands or millions of years in advance. But we still could not find much about this, unless we move the entire solar system out of the way. The solar system, we need a stellar engine, a mega structure which is used to steer a star through the galaxy. It's a kind of thing that might be built in the advanced civilization with the Dyson sphere level technology. That's thinking about the future millions of years ahead of time. But how do we possibly move the hundreds of thousands of objects in the solar system? Well, that's a good news. We can ignore all of that. We only need to move the sun. All the other objects are being glued to the sun, and they follow it wherever it goes. There are a lot of ideas about the stellar engine, how it might look, how it would work, we have picked up too, grounded in a current understanding of physics that could build in the theory.
The simplest kind of stellar engine is the Skadov thruster, a giant mirror. It works on the same principle as a rocket. Like rocket fuel, the photons released as solar radiation carry momentum, not a lot, but a bit. For example, if an astronaut turned on a flashlight in space, it would push them backwards very, very slowly. A stellar engine will work a little better than a flashlight because the sun produces a lot of photons. The basic idea of the Skadov thruster is to reflect up to half of the solar radiation to create thrust and slowly push the sun where we want it to go. In order for the Skadov thruster to work, it must be kept in the same place and not orbiting the sun. Although the sun's gravity will try to pull it in,
It would be supported by radiation pressure, which props the mirror up. This means the mirror would have to be very light, made of micron-thin reflecting foil from materials like aluminium alloys. Mirror's shape is important too. Enveloping the sun in a giant spherical shell wouldn't work because that would refocus light back to the sun, heating it up and creating all sorts of unpleasant problems. Instead, we use a parabola which sends most of the photons around the sun and in the same direction, which maximizes thrust. To prevent accidentally burning or freezing Earth with too much or too little sunlight, the only safe place to build a Skadov thruster is over the sun's poles. This means we can only move the sun vertically in the plane of the solar system and one direction in the Milky Way, which limits our travel options a bit. But that is basically it. For a civilization capable of building a Dyson sphere, this is a relatively simple endeavor. Not complicated, just very hard to build. At full throttle, the solar system would probably be moved by about 100 light years over 230 million years.
To gather this fuel, our thruster uses very large electromagnetic fields to funnel hydrogen and helium from the solar winds into the engine. The solar wind alone does not provide enough fuel though, and that's where the Dyson sphere comes in. Using its power, sunlight can be refocused to the surface of the sun. This heats small regions to extreme temperatures, lifting millions of tons of mass off the sun. This mass can be collected and separated into hydrogen and helium. The helium is burned explosively in a thermonuclear fusion reactors. A jet of radioactive oxygen at a temperature of nearly 1 billion degrees is expelled and becomes a primary source of propulsion. To prevent the engine from just crashing into the sun, it needs a balance itself. To do this, we accelerate the collected hydrogen with electromagnetic fields using the particles accelerators and shoot a jet back to the sun. This balances the thruster and transfers the thrust of our engine back to the sun. In a little as 1 million years, the engine can be moved the sun by 50 light years, more than enough to dodge a supernova. Stellar engines are the kind of machines built by the civilization, thinking not of in the terms of future or decades, years, but eons. Since we know that our sun will die one day, a stellar engine could allow the far future descendants of the humans to travel to other stars without ever having the venture into the terrific dark abs of the interstellar space. Until we build a stellar engine, we are adrift and subjected to the whims of the galactic sea. There is a very famous saying, I don't think the human race will survive the next 1,000 years unless we spread.
Good day to you all. Present here to see our topic climate intervention or climate engineering, commonly referred to as geoengineering. Geoengineering is a deliberate and large-scale intervention in the Earth's climate system, usually with the aim of mitigating the adverse effects of global warming. The most prominent subcategories of climate engineering are solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal.
Carbon dioxide removal refers to removing carbon dioxide gas CO2 from the atmosphere and sequestering it for long periods of time. With respect to climate, geoengineering is defined by the Royal Society as the deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's climate system. In order to moderate global warming, some environmental organizations have been reluctant to endorse solar radiation management, but are often more supportive of some carbon dioxide removal projects, such as afforestation and peatland restoration.
Some authors have argued that any public support for climate engineering may weaken the fragile political consensus to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The 1965 landmark report, Restoring the Quality of Our Environment by US President Lyndon B. Johnson's Science Advisory Committee warned of the harmful effects of fossil fuel emissions and also mentioned deliberately bringing about countervailing climatic changes, including rising the albedo or reflectivity of the Earth. Edward Teller in 1997 suggested to research and develop reflective particles to reduce incoming solar radiation and thus to cancel the effects of fossil fuels burning.
Several climate engineering strategies have been proposed. IPCC documents detail several proposals. These fall into two main categories. They are solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal.
Solar radiation management (SRM) techniques would seek to reduce sunlight absorption. This includes visible, near-infrared and ultraviolet rays. This would be achieved by deflecting sunlight from the earth or increasing the reflectivity of atmosphere on the earth's surface. These methods are not a substitute of climate change mitigation because they would not reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere and thus would not address problems such as ocean acidification caused by CO2.
Solar radiation management methods may include surface-based, for example, surface-based mirror infrastructures for protecting and expanding polar ice and glaciers, including the use of insulated blankets and artificial snow, using pale colors and for roofing materials and other man-made surfaces, attempting to change ocean's brightness, growing high albedo crops, or by distributing hollow glass beads in selected areas to increase ice coverage and lower temperatures. Mount Pinatubo in Philippines erupted with tremendous force, ejecting vast amounts of ash and gas high into the atmosphere, so high that volcano's plume penetrated the stratosphere. The stratosphere is a layer of atmosphere extending from about 10 kilometers to 50 kilometers in altitude. Pinatubo ejected about 15 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it reacted with water to form a hazy layer of aerosol particles composed primarily of sulfuric acid droplets. Over the course of next 2 years, the stratospheric winds spread these aerosol particles around the globe.
The World Wildlife Fund criticized iron fertilization experiments due to their potential risk to marine.
In today's world, scientists have made many fascinating and helpful inventions, and one of them and the most interesting topic among all the generations are robots. But till now, we have seen robots made up of metals, nuts and bolts. But today, we, the students of NL Dalmia High School, are going to tell you about the first living robots made by the scientists called Xenobots. Xenobots are the first living robots, and unlike another robots, they are not made up of metals, nuts and bolts, but they are made up of the skin and heart cells of frog embryo.
Now, you all might be thinking, what exactly is a living robot? And that would be a perfectly reasonable question, especially given the fact that it's being deemed a brand new life form that has never existed before. But before we can actually understand what it does and what that might mean for the future, we have to understand what Xenobots actually are.
What are Xenobots? Xenobots are named after the African clawed frog named Xenopus laevis. They are synthetic organisms which are automatically designed by computers to perform desired functions and are made up of combining different biological tissues. Xenobots are less than 1 millimeter wide and are composed of just two things: skin cells and heart muscle cells, both of which are derived from the stem cells which are harvested from the early blastula stage of the frog embryos. The skin cells provide rigid support while the heart muscle cells act as small motors by expanding and contracting in volume in order to propel the Xenobots forward.
The shape of Xenobot's body and its distribution of skin and heart cells are automatically designed in a simulation to perform specific tasks. using a method called trial and error. Xenobots have been designed to walk, swim, push pellets, carry payloads, and work together in a swarm to aggregate debris which is scattered around a dish and put them into neat piles. They can survive without food for weeks and they can heal themselves after laceration.
This is how the scientists created the first ever living robots, the Xenobots. As we all told you, the millimeter-wide Xenobots are made up of living cells from the frog embryos. The embryos are cut open and the cells inside are separated and incubated. And then they are slowly rebuilt. Biologists sculpt these miniature robots designed under a supercomputer. A Xenobot could move towards a target. Researchers hope these bots could clean oceans and clear human arteries.
Currently, Xenobots are primarily used as scientific tools to understand how cells cooperate to build complex bodies during morphogenesis. However, the behavior and biocompatibility of current Xenobots suggests several potential applications to which they may be put into the future. Given that Xenobots are composed solely of frog cells, they are biodegradable, and as swarms of Xenobots tend to work together to push microscopic pellets in a dish into central piles. It has been speculated that future Xenobots might be able to do the same thing with microplastics in the ocean. Find and aggregate tiny bites of plastic into the large ball of plastic that traditional boat or drone can gather and bring the cycling center.
Unlike traditional technologies, Xenobots do not adapt to additional pollution as they work and degrade. They behave using energy stored in the fats and proteins of the tissues, which last about a week and then end up as dead skin cells. In further clinical applications such as targeted drug delivery, Xenobots could be also made from a human patient's own cell, which will bypass the immune response challenge of other micro-robotic delivery systems. Potentially, Xenobots could be also used to scrap plaque from artery and for additional cell types and bioengineering low-entry diseases.
Now the question arises, how Xenobots are made? To make Xenobots, research team used a supercomputer to test thousands of random designs of simple living organisms that perform certain tasks. The computer is programmed with AI evolutionary algorithm which can predict the special features produced, such as moving towards a target. After selection of the most promising design, scientists attempted to replicate the virtual models using frog skin or heart cells.
The heart cell in these are bespoke assemblies, contracts and relax, giving the organism motion. The creation of Xenobots is groundbreaking, described being called as a programmable living bot. They are completely made up of organic and living tissues. The term robot has been used because they can be configured into different shapes and size, and they can be programmed to target certain objects, and they can also repair themselves after getting damaged.
The Xenobot is divided into two regions as shown by their colors. Towards the top we can see the green color, but when we come to the bottom we can see a transition of green and red colors. These colors denote the types of cells. The green color denotes the skin cells, while the red color denotes the heart cells of the frog